Those are the more spectacular claims which I will try to defend today. But this is the, well, I won't even call it intuitive background anymore because I have developed it sufficiently far. Okay? So, just to give you an update.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, okay. So I think this is important. Otherwise it would be boring and I would get worse objections. Okay, so in today's lecture I will further develop some prospects for a suitable 21st century idealism. The form of idealism whose outlines I will draw is a type of ontological idealism. As I will argue, it is sufficiently robust in order to account for internal realism where necessary. Even though some of Schelling's works and some recent French philosophy loom large in the background of my consideration, I will only focus on the systematic development and defense of the opening moves of a form of ontological idealism competitive in the overall landscape of recent philosophical work in both the former fields of analytic and continental philosophy. As I have already highlighted in the introduction, the contemporary philosophical avant-garde bursts with a new ontological optimism. As my explanation for this return of ontology, I suggested that this is justified with recourse to the axis which ties together ontology and epistemology, which I call Transcendental Logics, okay, using a fairly traditional term. In my view, Transcendental Logics is the analysis of our access to what there is, such that this analysis takes into account that this access itself belongs to what there is. Okay, so our access to what there is not any such thing as a transcendent view onto the world, but our access to what there is itself exists. Transcendental logic thus gives rise to what I call Transcendental Ontology, the theory which investigates the ontological conditions of our access conditions to what there is. The first thesis of Transcendental Ontology I have introduced was a thesis about the difference between what I called the basic conditional and the epistemological conditional. The basic conditional just says, if there's anything whatsoever, then such and such has to be the case. So ontology as an answer to the question what has to be the case if anything is the case, okay, can be built upon the ontological conditional, which says that, you know, if anything is the case, then such and such is the case. Given that the ontological conditional itself is the case, because I just asserted it, okay, it has the property of satisfying or fulfilling its own antecedent. Therefore, we can immediately conclude that such and such has to be the case. I'm not saying what it is. Doesn't matter at this point. Whereas the epistemological condition said that if we know anything whatsoever, then the conditions of knowing it are fulfilled. But this conditional has the skeptical property that we cannot guarantee that it's fulfilled. So even if we give the best definition of knowledge, this does never entail that there is knowledge. Okay, a definition of knowledge, you know, whatever, however refined your definition, you know, even if you lay out 37 conditions in addition to JTB, justified true belief, this never guarantees that there's an instance of knowledge. So if I tell you what knowledge is, this doesn't entail that anyone knows anything. Okay, not in the same way as that there is anything whatsoever when I'm capable of uttering a conditional. Now, recent speculative philosophers, I'm thinking of Graham Harman, Quentin Meillassoux, Ray Brassier, and other people, have argued that all traditional philosophy, and they think in particular of Descartes, Kant, Hegel, Husserl, Heidegger, and others, and even Wittgenstein, share a common tenet which makes them liable to a form of ontic nonsense. In particular, Quentin Meillassoux has maintained that the common denominator of all forms of idealism is what he calls correlationism. In his view, in one way or another, correlationism amounts to an undeniably nonsensical set of assertions, such as, and he thinks Kant was committed to these kinds of nonsensical assertions, the earth has not existed before man, or it would not be the case that there are stones if no one threw open a horizon determined by her being towards death. Okay, so it sounds as if Heidegger would say something like that. There are no stones if no one is dying. Or with Kant, just basically the same thing. You know, if I wouldn't have representations, there were no stones. This is what Kant seems to be saying, and sometimes he explicitly says so when he says, for example, that appearances are representations. Okay, Kantian appearances are, he says, representations. which entails that if there are no representations, there are no appearances. Stones, according to Kant, are appearances. Therefore, if no one thinks about stones, there are no stones. That would be ontic nonsense. In so many words, Meillassoux maintains that correlationists cannot account for what he calls ancestrality, that is, for the existence of things or facts before the existence of subject, subjectivity, communicative reason, finite Dasein, or whatever suitable candidate one might want to pick. Against Meillassoux, I will today defend the thesis that idealism does not amount to ontic nonsense. Idealism is not an ontical thesis about the correlation between subject and object. I don't even understand subject and object talk. Even if there are forms of idealism according to which objectivity in some sense depends on subjectivity, this is not tantamount to asserting that there are only objects if there are subjects. In the first part, I developed the notion of sense-dependence idealism, which goes back to a distinction by Bob Brandom. Sense-dependence idealism claims that existence entails intelligibility. In this context, I interpret intelligibility as appearance in a field of sense, and I argue that this is sufficient for existence. My point will not be that we never encounter things in themselves, but are trapped in our access conditions to what there is, which paradoxically makes us blind to facts, as many modern epistemologists have believed. Yet this is, of course, a fallacy, for it ultimately identifies fallibility with falsity. Okay, so I will not claim any such thing. I don't believe that, that a suitable interpretation of our fallibility or of finite knowledge entails that all of our beliefs could be false. This is a simple fallacy, which is why Descartes does not stop with fallibility, but adds the dreaming argument. Okay, just remember the 3 steps of Cartesian skepticism. Step first starts off with the Cartesian rule of prudence: never trust anyone who has deceived you once. Okay, but this, of course, does not entail that that a person who deceives you once could thereby have deceived you always. Okay, this is a simple fallacy, which is why Descartes needs the dreaming argument. So the fact that we can only have access to things if one set or other of access conditions are met does not at all entail that they are never met. It is actually analytically true, and as such not very informative, that we can only access what we can access. This does not entail any obstacle for true thoughts attaining things or facts in themselves, even though one might raise legitimate skeptical worries as to the actual status of our higher order beliefs regarding the question which beliefs are actually true. Okay, given that we are fallible for every belief, okay, also higher order beliefs about which beliefs in our belief box are true, given that we are fallible throughout our whole belief system, we can never guarantee that a particular instance of belief is a true thought. But there's no obstacle in the very notion of a true thought such that a true thought would, to put it with McDowell, stop short of the facts. If you have a true thought, then a fact or an object is literally part of a true thought. So if it is true that I'm sitting in a library currently, then the library is part of my thought, not a representation of the library, neither linguistic nor mental. Okay, so things can be parts of thoughts. This simply must not be a problem, because if this were a problem, okay, our access conditions to what there is could never be met in principle. Okay, but this is impossible. Here's an argument for this before I come to another move. Imagine you have the best realization of a capacity. For example, someone has the capacity to dance. And now the best realization of this capacity cannot fall short of dancing. Okay, if the best actualization of dancing, of the capacity to dance, would not be a dance, then it wouldn't be the capacity to dance. And the same holds for knowing. If we even have the capacity of knowing, and no epistemologist has denied that. Okay, so you can always give an analysis of some conditions or other of knowing. So if we have the capacity of knowing, then there can be no obstacle in the best actualization of this capacity, which would make it such that this actualization still falls short of the facts. Okay? I will argue in this context that facticity is the facticity of sense. This facticity might be discovered at the heart of subjectivity, but it is not restricted to subjectivity. The crucial point in this part of my account is the reminder that there is an objective notion of sense, of accessibility, introduced and defended by Frege, even though one might see something similar at work in Husserl's notion of adumbrations and the associated methodology of eidetic variation. Sense need not be subjective and passe Frege, it need not even be conceptual in any straightforward manner. A minimal orientation is sufficient for the notion of sense I will use. So let's come to the first part of today's lecture, Facticity and Accessibility, the case for sense-dependent idealism. In both the analytic tradition and in the most recent realist turn of French philosophy, idealism is often accused of a metaphysically outrageous claim. According to the standard criticism, which is the highest common factor in the motivational structures of most realist confessions and defenses of either common sense or science, idealism claims that there's only a particular kind of object if there's only a particular kind of subject. Most radically stated, that is, global idealism would amount to something like the claim that all objects are dependent on a or the subject, or rather on subjectivity. This would be global idealism. You might be a local idealist, like Dummett, for example. You might be an anti-realist about the past, and this might legitimately be called an idealism about the past. Naturally, any such claim, like a global idealism, if anyone has ever seriously defended it in this rough form, is either blatantly wrong or, to say the very least, conceptually misguided. There are many objects, for example trees, which are not in principle or metaphysically dependent on a subject or subjectivity. In order to steer clear of this, Kant was wary to defend a formal idealism which did not claim that the existence of objects depended on subjectivity, but that only some essential formal features were constituted by the subject or constitutively related to the subject. Now, Meillassoux subsumes all forms of idealism under the label of correlationism. In order to begin to see the prospects of a serious form of idealism, let us first take a closer look at his characterization of correlationism. I quote, and then you can easily see why we don't need to be committed to any such thing. By correlation, we mean the idea according to which we only ever have access to the correlation between thinking and being, and never to either term considered apart from the other. We will henceforth call correlationism any current of thought which maintains the unsurpassable character of the correlation so defined. Correlationism consists in disqualifying the claim that it is possible to consider the realms of subjectivity and objectivity independently of one another. End of quote. Right in the next sentence, he replaces subjectivity with subject and objectivity with object. At least in this passage, there is no clue to any distinction between the subjectivity-objectivity and the subject-object dichotomy. But I think they are really very different. So there are two claims, okay, and now we can distinguish them with a very handy distinction by Robert Brandom, which he uses in order to read Hegel. One claim says that there is a correlation between subject and object such that were there no subject, there wouldn't be any objects. Okay, maybe Berkeley has said so, maybe Kant has said so, okay? And the other claim is more interesting and can be defended to a certain extent, and it says that in order to understand objectivity, we need to understand subjectivity, okay? So let's call, let's call the one claim reference dependence idealism and the other sense dependence idealism. Brandom defines sense dependence and reference dependence in the following way. I quote, "Concept P is sense dependent on concept Q, just in case one cannot count as having grasped P unless one counts as having grasped Q. Concept P is reference dependent on concept Q, just in case P cannot apply to something unless Q applies to something." Okay, so it might be the case that we can only understand that we have objective knowledge because we understand what it is to be a subject. That's a good enough claim, and you can call this sense dependence idealism, and I will defend something like this. Whereas the other form of idealism drops out of the picture, which would say that there are no objects if there are no subjects. Okay? Because in this case there couldn't be any such thing as an evolution of the subject. We would come out of nowhere, which is a ridiculous claim. Okay, so in order for a subject to exist, okay, there they are. So I will just repeat the distinction. Okay, here's the important distinction. I quote Robert Brandon. Concept P is sense-dependent on concept Q, just in case one cannot count as having grasped P, unless one counts as having grasped Q. Concept P is reference-dependent on concept Q, just in case P cannot apply to something unless Q applies to something. And I said that idealism was nonsensical if it was reference-dependence idealism, whereas it might be a good claim if it is sense-dependence idealism. Okay, so just to repeat, sense-dependence idealism has it that we only have a notion of objectivity because we have a notion of subjectivity, which is a fine claim, whereas the reference-dependence idealism claims that there are no objects if there are no subjects. Okay, something about this must simply be false, for otherwise the subject wouldn't exist. Okay, so given that I can understand that there is something like the phylogenesis of the human species, okay, which is the only candidate of a subject in the tradition, given that I can understand this, I need to make sure that subjects can arise from somewhere. So there needs to be a prehistory of the subject, evidently, otherwise we get crazy claims. And if there is such a thing as a natural history of the subject, then reference dependence needs to be false. Otherwise, the subject would create itself and its own phylogenesis, which maybe Fichte has said, but then that's bad news for Fichte. Okay, so I think anyone who's literally committed to this claim, okay, is so outrageously false that there's no need to really discuss this. Okay, whereas sense-dependence idealism just says that there must in some way or other be a relation between existence and intelligibility. I will defend a version of sense-dependence idealism according to which whatever exists is intelligible. So what exists, okay, is accessible, which does, by the way, not mean, okay, that we will ever have access to it. Accessibility does not entail actual access. Okay, I'm just saying there's nothing we could in principle not refer to, which does not entail that there's nothing we will never have referred to. It might be that the history of the human species is so short that you know, in 10,000 years we disappear due to like the explosion of an atom bomb in Naples, and that's it. Everything blows up because they are hiding, you know, atomic garbage in Naples, as we all know. So that might be the end of the story. And then by then we maybe know a millionth of what there is to be known, maybe, if we're lucky, in 10,000 years. So I'm not saying that everything which exists will at some point or other be known, etc. And also there might be simply contingent factors which make it such that we will never know it. For example, the exact number of hairs on Caesar's head when he crossed the Rubicon. Okay, there's a determinate number. It is accessible in my sense. It is intelligible, which does not mean that we will ever have access to the exact number of hairs on Caesar's head when he was crossing the Rubicon. But there's no principal ontological obstacle in what there is to it being, to its accessibility. Now, before I can plunge into the defense of my form of sense-dependence idealism, it is crucial to decide on a candidate for an adequate understanding of sense. For reasons I have developed yesterday, mutatis mutandis, I accept Frege's notion of sense. Frege famously understands sense as mode of presentation. He introduces his concept of sense in order to explain how identity statements can be both non-contradictory and cognitively informative. Sense provides us with an access to what there is, opening objects to our understanding. By definition, there is no access to what there is independently of sense. There is no senseless reference. If there were a senseless reference, it would amount to an access to what there is, which would be independent of any particular access. Things or facts in this case would be accessible from something like a view from nowhere. However, a view from nowhere is either not a view at all, or it is a view. If it is a view, then there will be a mode of presentation attached to it. Furthermore, the very negation of sense is itself a sense. To present something as if not presented is itself a presentation, a particular one on top of that. Sense cannot be negated without generating further sense. In a remarkable passage, and often neglected, Frege himself admits this. I quote, this is Frege, so I'm not lying. Okay. The sense of a proper name is grasped by everybody who is sufficiently familiar with the language or totality of designations to which it belongs. but this serves to illuminate only a single aspect of the reference, supposing it to have one. Comprehensive knowledge of the reference would require us to be able to say immediately whether any given sense belongs to it. To such knowledge we never attain. Frege, to such knowledge we never attain. Okay, so to really know that a particular expression, proper name, or whatever, has a referent, we would have to have comprehensive knowledge of the reference, which would require us to be able to say immediately of any given sense whether it belongs to it or not. Quote Frege, to such knowledge we never attain. In Frege's famous example, morning star and evening star would be different senses of the same referent, namely Venus. However, the simple disquotational move is obviously insufficiently reflected, as Frege is well aware. For Venus is itself a proper name and therefore has a sense. To present the identical referent of morning star and evening star is to present it under a particular mode of presentation, which evidently differs from the mode of presentation both of morning star and evening star. If Venus did not differ in mode of presentation from either of its presentations as morning or as evening star, there would not be its modes of presentation. Hence, there is no way to attain knowledge of a referent independently of any mode of excess. Okay, so very simple. I will make the story more complicated when we come to numbers. Okay. So morning star is the evening star, and now the question, Frege's question is, so what does this mean? Okay, and the answer is Venus. No quotes. Okay, but as soon as we give the answer, so you know, what do both morning star and evening star refer to? As soon as we say Venus, we use a proper name, namely Venus, and also it is true. The following is true: morning star equals evening star equals Venus. Okay. And now the question is, okay, what does this refer to? So what is the identical referent of the expressions Venus, evening star, and morning star? Okay? At the most, you get an X there. Okay, because whenever you have an answer, whenever you give an answer to the question, you will have to present what I called it, capital I yesterday. You have to present it under a particular mode of presentation. And even if you say that there is something which is presented by its modes of presentations without it itself being a particular mode of presentation, then this way of singling it out turns it into a particular mode of presentation. Okay? To say of something that it is given to any modes of presentations, okay, is to present it under a particular mode of presentation. So the very negation of all modes of presentations is a mode of presentation. Okay? Because to be presented from nowhere is to be presented from somewhere which is different from somewhere. Okay? Nowhere, given that nowhere is not somewhere, nowhere is somewhere. Therefore, okay, you only get an X here. But actually you don't even get an X. Okay, so, but for the time being, let's call this X. This is, what I just spelled out, of course not identical with the claim attributed to correlationism by Meillassoux. As he explicitly writes, correlationism is committed to, I quote again, the idea according to which we only ever have access to the correlation between thinking and being, and never to either term considered apart from the other. Yet, the claim that we cannot have access to reference without sense does not amount to the claim that we can only ever have access to their correlation. On the contrary, what we have access to, granted that there are instances of a successful access, is not always access itself, but rather things, states of affairs, or facts. If there are horses, then my thought that there are horses has access to horses. Thinking does not stop short of the facts, as McDowell famously puts this point with Wittgenstein, and it is important to add, true thought does not stop short of the facts, but false thought does. So false thought actually stops short of the facts, whereas true thought doesn't. Sense dependence is thus not correlationism. It is not even a correlation, as Frege correctly pointed out, against the correspondence theory of truth and its associated representationalism. Also, senses are not representations. They are nothing like subjective mental states or Vorstellungen of any other kind. They are rather accessibility conditions which open up what I call fields of sense. Once a field of sense is established, there is objectivity. And in some sense, there's full-fledged objectivity with the widest cosmological role, as Crispin Wright has called this, where the width of cosmological role concerns the distance between understanding a fact with or without recourse to our understanding of it. So facts with the widest possible cosmological role are such facts which you can understand without understanding anything about subjective access conditions to what there is. So you can, if you understand that there's a star has just exploded in a galaxy so far away that we will probably never know anything about this event, okay? If you understand this, you do not thereby understand anything about understanding, okay? You don't have recourse to understanding, you only understand something about a star, okay? You don't understand anything about understanding, not straightforwardly. So that's the widest cosmological role, whereas, for example, mental states are facts with a very narrow cosmological role, because in order to understand mental states, we have to have mental states. Okay? Therefore, we need to understand something about understanding, okay, in order to understand mental states. Therefore, their cosmological role is very narrow. Okay? This is Crispin Wright's intuition. That's what he calls the width of cosmological role. The notion of an object in a relevant domain is fixed such that there's only a limited or a finite space for maneuvers to assert and to deny. So for every field of sense, there is a width of cosmological role in its truth predicate. Okay, so if you have, the field of sense of planets. Okay. Now you have, this is the field of sense of planets, Fp, and now you have the Earth, Venus, and whatever planets there are, okay? So this is a fairly big field, and then this field, okay, is individuated by a certain sense, okay? And part of the sense is such that a truth predicate is operative in assertions, okay, making the field available to thought such that a particular width of cosmological role is associated with this field. Okay, in this case, a very wide cosmological role, whereas mental states, okay, say my mental states, okay, mental states Gabriel, okay, are such that itch and toe, hunger, whatever, and they have a very narrow cosmological role. This basic intuition, or the basic intuition behind this, can be illustrated with a train of thought used by Putnam in order to motivate his internal realism. And now let me just repeat the example and make it more complicated than yesterday. Let's say that there are 3 cubes on a table, a red cube, a white cube, and a blue cube. If we ask the question how many objects are there on the table, a natural answer would be 3. However, in order to arrive at this answer, the domain of reference needs to be established first. There are, to be precise, transfinitely many ways of arranging the objects on the table. To any arrangement, there corresponds one or at least a finite, albeit in some case vague, number as the correct answer to the question how many objects there are on the table. Besides the determination of object as cube, we might be asked to count the colors, the sides, the atoms, the quarks. We might put the 3 cubes together and think of this as an artwork, etc. A sense, in the sense used here, would be one way of arranging the objects, which would make the table cube world accessible under a particular mode of presentation. Yet there is no answer to the question, how many objects are there to Kur, because there are simply no objects to Kur. Okay? But what objects are relative to are not mental states, representations, subjects, or whatever, but objects are relative to a sense, where a sense is a mode of presentation. So, which is why sense is in a full-fledged sense objective. So let's call this the allegory of the cubes. The allegory of the cubes teaches us that there is ontological vagueness, for there is no singular meta rule which encompasses all possible modes of arrangement. Okay? So, imagine here are the three cubes. Okay, so think of this as a three-dimensional representation of the three cubes. Okay? Now, now they look like the ur-elements of the allegory of the cubes. And now you might have different variations of the scene. Okay? You have the world which really consists of the three objects. Okay? And then you have the arrangement where you count the sides, and you have, I will not draw this out, 16 sides. Okay? And now we have two objects. Okay? The object which consists of 16 parts, elements, and the object which consists of 3. Okay? Because field 1, this is field 1, where the correct answer to the question how many objects are there in the world is 3, because we are counting cubes. And this is F2, where we are counting cube sides. Okay? But F1 and F2 are objects in the field of sense of the thought which we are currently entertaining. Therefore, there's a field of sense. Okay? F star, where star, upper star indicates higher order, okay, which encompasses F2 and F1, okay. Now the question is, which sense is attached to F star? And whatever answer you give, okay, to the algorithm which you might have used in order to individuate all possible answers to the question how many objects are there in the allegory of the cubes, okay, whatever answer you give, there will always be a constitutive meta rule which you have not in view. Okay? Here's a proof. If it were ever possible to account for all possible ways of accounting for the existence in a particular field of sense, together with all possible rules of thinking about this, okay, you would have an absolute meta rule, right? But an absolute meta rule would define a field of sense of all fields of senses. But there cannot be a field of sense of all fields of senses, as I have argued yesterday, because this field could not appear in a field. And to exist, according to the definition I'm using, is appearance in a field. Okay? So if there was a singular meta rule, okay, running through all of the universe, as it were, okay, being the principle of a theory of everything, then this meta rule would generate a field of sense of all fields of sense. But there is no field of sense of all fields of sense, because if there were, it had to appear in another higher order field of sense, which is impossible for the allegedly all-encompassing field of sense. Therefore, okay, the non-existence of the world, the non-existence of a field of sense of all fields of sense, entails the non-existence of an absolute meta rule, which can be specified as an algorithm running through all of the universe. Given that there's no such thing, okay, there's no way of both accounting for objects and of at the same time accounting for our counting of them. Okay, we're necessarily blind. Okay, so Wittgenstein's point, we follow the rule blindly, is not, well, we just happen to follow the rule blindly. Okay, sometimes in Wittgenstein it sounds as if, well, human beings are just made such that we follow the rule blindly. Okay, interpretations come to an end. Okay, it sounds like this sometimes in Wittgenstein, but here is an argument to the effect that by necessity, if we follow any rule, okay, there's some blindness involved, okay, or self-consciousness is by necessity opaque. However we put it, there will always be a rule which has not been accounted for. If there weren't, there would be a field of all fields, but there can't be a field of all fields, therefore there is no ultimate meta rule. Okay? So whatever conceptual operation we perform, it will always at some point or other be performed in nothingness. Okay? There will always be an empty, not defined space within which we operate. You know, if you have a Buddhist moment, you might call this nirvana. Okay? So And then you would say that this is enlightenment, but maybe that goes too far because I don't feel like very enlightened when I say these things. So. But maybe enlightenment is not a mental state. Okay, so there is no definite mode of arrangement, no hyper situation, which would once and for all settle the notion of an arrangement. This is not tantamount to saying that there are only perspectives and interpretations but no facts, given that there are facts about perspectives and interpretations. Thus, modern epistemology misidentified the origin of the plurality of modes of access. It did not grasp the ontological reason for epistemological plurality. So what I'm saying is that, you know, Nietzsche and so forth, they thought that the plurality of perspectives is due to the subject. Okay, that's Nietzsche's notion of a corner, of the Ecke. So Nietzsche thinks that, you know, I quote, we cannot look around our corner. And then everyone, like, in a sense, agreed to this because everyone believed that there's something, that there are limitations of knowledge. But I'm saying that there are no limitations of knowledge, okay, but that there are ontological limitations. The fact that we cannot grasp everything is an ontological fact and not a fact about us. Okay, in the sense that, yeah, if we could only repair our limitations, we would then grasp everything. There's no way to repair this. Okay, whatever you do, there's no possible position from which you could formulate the rules for the hyper situation, because there's no hyper situation. Of course, this is far from being the end of the story, for the world I have presented as the cube world is not as simple as I suggested. So things are much more complicated than I just suggested. The arrangement I have used in order to present the plurality of modes of arrangements is evidently another arrangement, as much as it is misleading to think of the allegory of the cubes in terms of a fixed set of ready-made minimal objects, which would then go into various arrangements. Okay? So, for example, Putnam in his mereological argument. So Putnam does something like this, but he says, well, let's think of three objects, x1, x2, and x3, right? So depending on your ontological commitments, you might think of this as three objects, x1, 2, and 3, or you might count mereological sums into your ontology, which makes sense because there are obviously things such as tables which consist of other things. Given that there are things consisting of other things, okay, x1 plus x2 might just be an object x4, okay, such as x1, x2, x3 put together might be another object. So if there are mereological sums, and there are, otherwise I wouldn't be sitting here, I am a mereological sum. Given that there are mereological sums, okay, the very idea of presenting the world as consisting of x1, x2, and x3, which then go into arrangements, is already oversimplifying. Okay, there are no elements, which is, by the way, a truth of set theory. The only elements of sets are sets. There are no elements. Also, sense as such is not subjective. Sense is part of the world. It is not an exclusively subjective realm. It is a mode of arrangement such that something comes to be presented in a particular way. This presentation is sometimes, but not necessarily, subjective. Presentation is not always a presentation for a subject, consciousness, language, or any other representational system, for they themselves have to be presented in some way or other in order for them to exist. Okay, so I call presentation, for example, my presence, even if I'm sleeping and you know, I'm sleeping on my bed, then I am a presentation for the bed, and the bed is a presentation for me, even though there's no mental state involved. Okay, otherwise I would die because I sleep. Okay, so there needs to be an ontological distinction, okay, between me and the bed, which is not dependent upon my entertaining this distinction. There needs to be a fact about me such that I'm not the bed, and this fact is not made up by me. It's not that I could change this, like, oh, but I want to be an object together with the bed. Okay, I can't become an object with the bed, only a very weird object. Maybe in the future we will create objects which are such that it might make sense, okay, to speak of such things as human beds, okay, but this concept doesn't have any application yet, okay, and I don't see, you know, how this would look. But maybe, but currently there's no such thing. So, yet it doesn't follow that the subject's presentation is necessarily a presentation to itself. In other words, it is inevitable to take into account what I call the facticity of sense. Some sense is always already made. Even in the ancestral world, the world before the dawn of humanity, things had to be arranged in some intangible manner, even though it is of no particular importance that this intelligible arrangement be conceptualized by a representational system. Sense, thus, defines a space of objectivity. Yet within this space, within its field of sense, it does not itself appear. On the contrary, it is, as I have argued, actually impossible for any field of sense that both some objects and their mode of arrangement are presented within the same field. For to arrange both some objects and their arrangement would be a different arrangement than the original arrangement of things. Any arranged sense generates another sense on a different level. For this reason, the facticity of sense is necessarily opaque. Even a sense becomes itself the content of a different arrangement, including some sense within its field of sense. There is always some sense in the background, as it were, which has not yet been conceptualized, even though it can become the content of a different field of sense. Within the framework I have defended so far, and this is an important argument now, an infinite regress in any technical sense of the term cannot arise. So some people have objected that this leads me into an infinite regress. Okay, so you have, yesterday it might have sounded like this. So I said, you know, for object O, my left hand, okay, for object O to exist is for object O to appear in a field of sense. So this is O, and this is F1. So for, say, the field of sense of human sensibility, okay? We all have sufficiently sophisticated sensory capacities in order to discriminate my left hand in this room. So my left hand appears in the field of sense. In this case, okay, the field of sense open to be sensed by us. Okay, a field of sense in this sense, no pun intended. Okay, so that's object O in F1. Now, in order for F1 to exist, okay, F1 has to appear in F2. And for F2 to exist, F2 has to appear in F3. Algorithm infinite regress. Done. Okay? Now you might bite the bullet and say, well, infinite regress, good. You might even say, well, I just proved that there are infinitely many things. You know, you might think of this as a proof for the existence of infinitely many things, or whatever. Okay? But now I will argue that this doesn't even arise. There are no infinite regresses in ontology. Why? This is quite easy to see. But it is also quite revolutionary, because it proves that there's one domain of thought where the ancient tool of infinite regresses has no application. This entails that any formal or any kind of logic you might have, which has it such that an infinite regress can be used in a reductio ad absurdum against a particular thought, fails because it's not sufficiently universal. There's no such thing as a universal tool of infinite regresses which you can use against your enemy, which is traditional, right? So, haha, infinite regress. Okay, that's a standard move. You always look for infinite. You know, it's even worse than circle, because some people have said there's good circularity. Maybe, as we had over lunch, there might be good constitutional circularity. Okay, for example, if you have the German constitution, it rules out its own negation. So you cannot vote against democracy in Germany. You can only vote within democracy. It's impossible to vote against. This is a circle, okay? But it might be a good circle. So many people like circularity, okay? The Germans have a particular thing with circularity, okay? Hegel, circle of circles, Gadamer, hermeneutic circle. So Germans like circles, okay? And, you know, that's something we have in common with the ancient Greeks. They also thought that circles were great. Okay. But no one has liked infinite regresses, right? Infinite regresses cause a lot of trouble. Now, if that's correct, the argument I will now give you, then there's no such thing as infinite regresses as a general threat to thought. Okay? So now, because here it doesn't even arise, and I will now introduce the notion, which is different, of a transfinite regress. Let's see how that looks. So let's stipulate the existence of at least one object O. O has to appear within a field of sense in order for it to exist. If it didn't appear within a field of sense, it wouldn't be determined as anything at all. It would not be arranged in any particular manner. Yet not to be arranged in any particular manner is to be arranged in the very particular manner of not being arranged in any particular manner. There is a sense to the senseless. Therefore, if O exists, there is at least one field of sense F1. This is where we started, and it seemed to trigger an infinite regress. Now, F1 is not what I call reflected in O in the sense that it is not identical with O. In order to investigate into F1, it has to become an object of a different investigation. Thus, we create a field of sense which encompasses O and F. Okay? So this is what I did, and which looks like an infinite regress. Now we're here at F2. So you have O appears in F1, and now F1 and O appear in F2, right? So this is where we stand. This is the level of reflection. We're on the third order of thinking. We are thinking about an object. This new field of sense F2 is neither identical with O nor with F1. Thus, whenever we reflect on the constitution of a particular field of sense, this reflection moves within another field of sense. Yet, the transition from one field to the next does not generate a linear ascent on a logical order of reflexive levels. One for the important reasons for this is that neither O nor F1 as an object encompassed in F2 do necessarily belong to only one field of sense. As a matter of fact, for any object, there is an indefinite range of possibilities to be arranged in different manners. Okay? For example, if you think this is happening, okay, then you also have to take into account that at the same time, this is happening. Why? Take an example. This is a piece of chalk. Okay? As a piece of chalk, I just presented it to you in a particular field of sense, namely the field of sense of your awareness. Okay? If you're aware of this thing, now it's in F1. Okay? Now that you just thought about it, you are in F2. Good. Looks like a regress. However, at the same time, and we weren't aware of this piece of chalk also appears, okay, in the field of physics. Why? Because it has a particular physical structure. For example, it has n quarks, or strings, or it consists of n strings, whatever that consists here means, okay? Say this is 2 billion strings, okay? As 2 billion strings, it appears in F3, where F3 is the field of sense individuated by the criteria of identity of strings. Okay, so O is here in F1 as a piece of chalk and as a number of strings in F3. Okay, now you just thought this, therefore you move in F4. Okay, we just thought this. So you get F5. But F5 is not just a transition in O, F1, F2. Okay? You don't get from O, you don't get from thinking about the fact, you don't get from O exists in the field of sense exists in the field of sense exists in the field of sense, to F5, because in order to get to F5, you need to consider that O appears in F3, which is of a different, very different order, physics. Okay? Therefore, you have, if anything, two infinite regresses, which are just encompassed into one infinite regress. Okay? And now think of this whole big thing, which contains two infinite regresses, okay, as of another infinite regress, okay, which is triggered by the fact that this whole thing is an object. This whole thing is an object. In order for it to exist, it has to appear in a field of sense, blah, blah, blah. Okay? So, there's no singular algorithm which runs over all fields of sense, but there are various algorithms, okay? And there's no meta rule, because if there were, and so forth, you would get an all-encompassing field of sense. So this entails, okay, that there's no infinite regress, according to any interpretation of infinite regress so far known, because there's no singular algorithm, which triggers the transition from one field of sense to the next. Ah, okay, I thought, okay. Here's another argument for the necessary, for this necessary ontological incompleteness. One more argument, and then I stop and open the discussion, but I give you one more. Here's another argument for this necessary ontological incompleteness, which is necessary within the bounds of the fields of sense or fields of sense, understood in the way they are presented here. Okay, because never forget, this is just a field of sense. Okay, I'm creating a field of sense here now, and this field of sense, okay, is internally structured by a what I call a transfinite regress, which is a transfinite dissemination of fields of sense in transfinitely many directions. As I've argued yesterday, the following argument bears a certain family resemblance to Cantor's theorem, yet it is not strictly limited to the foundations of set theory. Let us presuppose per impossibile a single rule of arrangement applicable to the formation of all and any fields of sense, a transcendental rule in the strong sense of a universal and necessary rule. Then we would have a number of fields of sense and a formation rule which might trigger an infinite regress. Yet there has to be a field of sense within which the formation rule can be determined as being such and so. Otherwise it couldn't exist, for existence is at the very least tied to the possibility of appearing in a field of sense. Now, the apparent rule could not be identical with the rule applied to the very formation of the field of sense within which it appears. For the rule applied to the very formation of the field of sense within which it appears cannot constitute itself as an object. Otherwise, it would not be in the position of sense of a rule. Therefore, there is no possibility of making a transcendental rule explicit by saying what it is. Yet an absolutely indeterminate rule cannot exist either, for it would have to be determined as indeterminate, or at least determinable as indeterminable, for that matter. For this and other pertaining reasons, there is no single rule, no rail to infinity, which would prescribe the linear direction of an infinite regress. Or in other words, there is no algorithm of sense. So I stop here so that we can go into these details, and I just give you an overview over where this would have led me today and where this will lead me tomorrow. Okay? Because we need to think this through. Okay, tomorrow I will say that there's a field of sense, F. Okay? And F is defined by associated with a constitutive rule. Okay? Then I call this possibility. Okay? An entry. Or, given that we are talking documentality, I will call this an inscription. So, an inscription, there are many inscriptions in the field of sense, say 3, okay, is called actuality. Okay, now I define possibility as the capacity of a field of sense to contain something, and actuality is the property of an inscription into a field of sense which it has to actualize in order for it to exist. Okay, so now we have existence as possibility and existence as actuality, and then I will understand contingency as a relation between at least two inscriptions such that this relation could not be the case, okay, could not have been the case, whereas the relation between two inscriptions such as 7 and 5, okay, 7 plus 5 equals 12, for example, might then be called necessary. So contingency and necessity are intra-field modalities, whereas possibility and actuality are properties of a field. and the whole thing is existence. So I go very much back to Aristotle here and say that the modalities are, let me use a Heideggerian metaphor to conclude, are folds of being, okay? So the modalities can in this way be reconstructed again as folds of being if you give it this interpretation. So maybe I stop here and open the field for criticism.